Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
What if the moment he starts changing is not random, but the final sign that union is closer than it has ever been? What if the distance, the silence, the confusion, the delays, the resistance, all of it, was leading to one breaking point inside him? A point where he can no longer remain the same man and still step into the love his soul has been preparing him for. Because the truth is this: he does not change when it is convenient. He changes when staying the same becomes unbearable. And for many divine masculines, that shift happens right before union. Not because union is a reward, not because love magically fixes him, but because real union demands the death of the version of him that could not hold it before. The old him could feel the connection but run from it. The old him could love deeply but still choose fear. The old him could recognize her soul but not yet have the courage to meet it fully. So why does he change right before union? Why does the masculine often begin softening, awakening, returning, or becoming more honest only after everything seems lost? Why does transformation often happen at the final threshold, not at the beginning? And what if the change you are seeing is not just emotional growth, but the sign that something inside him is finally surrendering to the truth he could no longer avoid? In this video, we're going deep into the spiritual, emotional, and psychological reason he changes right before union, and why the man who enters union cannot be the same man who once ran from it. Chapter 1: Why Union Requires a Different Version of Him. People often imagine union as a romantic destination, a return, a reunion, a final coming together after all the lessons, all the longing, all the pain, all the distance. They imagine it as the moment when love finally wins, when the divine masculine finally returns, when the connection settles into peace after so much uncertainty. But true union is not simply a reunion between two people. It is a reunion with truth. And that is why he cannot enter union as the same man who once ran from it. This is one of the deepest realities of the twin flame path, and one of the most misunderstood. Many people assume union is about timing, fate, destiny, divine orchestration, and emotional readiness in the abstract. But beneath all of those ideas is a harsher, more honest truth. Union requires a different version of him. Not a slightly improved version. Not a more emotional version. Not a temporarily softened version. A different version. Because the man who could not hold truth before cannot sustain sacred love now. The old version of him may have felt the connection deeply. He may have sensed the significance. He may have known, at some level, that this was not ordinary. He may have been shaken by it, haunted by it, transformed internally by the presence of the divine feminine in ways he could not fully explain. But feeling the connection and being able to live in union are not the same thing. That is the hard truth. The old him could long and still hide. He could love and still avoid. He could recognize her soul and still choose fear. He could feel called and still remain loyal to the defenses that kept him emotionally unavailable. So why does he often change right before union? Because union is not asking whether he feels enough. It is asking whether he has become capable of holding what he feels without betraying it. And that requires the death of the old self. This is what many people miss when they romanticize the journey. They focus on the love, the signs, the synchronicities, the longing, the magnetic pull between the divine masculine and divine feminine. But real union does not happen merely because the love is real. The love may have always been real. The issue was never always the depth of the bond. The issue was whether the masculine had become someone who could meet that bond with truth, steadiness, accountability, and emotional presence. And often he had not. Not yet. Because sacred union does not just welcome emotion. It demands embodiment. It demands that he stop living in contradiction. It demands that he stop saying one thing inwardly and living another outwardly. It demands that he stop using silence as safety, distance as power, and confusion as a shield. It demands that the version of him who once survived through fear no longer be the one leading. That is why a different version of him is required. Because union is too honest for the old self. The old self could survive in separation. The old self could survive in longing. The old self could survive in fantasy, in potential, in almosts and maybes and one-day promises. But union is different. Union is reality. It is presence. It is consistency. It is truth lived, not just truth felt. It is emotional responsibility. It is the end of hiding behind the masks that once helped him function, but kept him from being fully known. And masks cannot sustain sacred intimacy. They can impress. They can protect. They can delay vulnerability. They can maintain an image of strength. But they cannot hold union. Because union brings everything false into the light. If he is still ruled by pride, union will expose it. If he is still ruled by fear, union will expose it. If he still confuses emotional control with emotional maturity, union will expose it. If he still wants love while remaining loyal to the defenses that destroy love, union will expose that too. That is why the old version of him must begin to die before union can truly happen. Not because he is being punished. Because love at this level does not allow fragmentation to remain hidden forever. Think about it this way. If a man has spent years defining strength as detachment, wisdom as caution, and self-protection as control, then union will threaten everything he thinks makes him strong. Because union is not built on detachment. It is built on presence. It is not built on emotional distance. It is built on openness. It is not built on hiding behind timing, practicality, or fear. It is built on the courage to let the inside and outside finally match. That is an entirely different kind of masculinity. And until he becomes that man, union remains unstable, even if love is present. This is why some connections can feel profound for years and still not land in true union. The love is not necessarily the missing piece. The missing piece is the masculine's capacity to live in alignment with that love. He may feel it deeply. He may miss her. He may think about her constantly. He may even spiritually understand what the connection is. But if he is still being led by the old identity, then the connection remains trapped inside contradiction. He wants her but runs. He feels deeply but stays silent. He knows but avoids. He longs but does not yet know how to remain. And union cannot be built on that. That is why the change before union is so profound. Because it is not just a mood shift. Not just a season of emotional openness. Not just a temporary moment of clarity. It is an identity shift. The man who once chose fear starts becoming a man who cannot tolerate fear making his decisions anymore. The man who once hid behind confusion starts becoming a man who needs truth more than he needs image. The man who once used distance to regulate his inner world starts becoming a man willing to stay, present with discomfort instead of immediately escaping it. This is not cosmetic growth. This is spiritual reconstruction. And reconstruction is painful, because every part of the old self resists being replaced. The old identity says, "You have survived this long by staying guarded. Do not change now. Do not risk everything for vulnerability. Do not let love undo you. Do not become someone who needs too much, feels too much, reveals too much." But union asks for exactly that undoing. Not as weakness, as truth. It asks him to stop identifying with the self that was built around survival and begin becoming the self that can live in love without abandoning itself. That is why the version of him required for union is different. different in how he relates to pain, different in how he relates to truth, different in how he carries responsibility, different in how he handles vulnerability, different in how he defines power. The old him thought power meant control. The new him begins to understand power as integrity. The old him thought safety meant distance. The new him begins to discover safety in honesty. The old him thought masculine strength meant staying unreadable. The new him begins to embody strength through presence, groundedness, and emotional truth. That is the version of him union requires. Because sacred union is not merely about getting the girl, returning to the connection, or finally allowing the relationship to happen. It is about becoming internally congruent enough that love no longer has to fight his defenses just to reach him. That sentence matters deeply. Love should not have to fight his defenses forever. At some point, if union is real, he must become someone who stops making love prove itself against his wounds. Someone who stops asking connection to carry what only inner transformation can resolve. Someone who understands that longing is not enough. Desire is not enough. Even spiritual recognition is not enough. Capacity is required. The capacity to tell the truth. To stay. To repair. To be accountable. To stop weaponizing silence. To stop hiding behind ambiguity. To let the emotional and spiritual truth of the bond become something he is willing to live, not just privately ache over. This is why the final approach to union is often so intense. Because what is happening is not only reunion energy. It is death energy. The death of the old masculine self. The death of the man who could feel sacred love and still live divided from it. The death of the one who could recognize truth and still choose avoidance. The death of the man who needed control more than he needed alignment. That man cannot cross the threshold. A new one must emerge. And maybe that is why the change so often comes late. Because transformation at this level is not a small correction. It is not just learning to communicate better or becoming a little more emotionally available. It is the painful dismantling of an entire inner structure. It is the collapse of the old definitions of strength, masculinity, and survival. It is the soul forcing the man to become someone his former self would have called too vulnerable, too open, too exposed. But that former self was never built for union. It was built for protection. And sacred love, eventually, asks him to choose something greater than protection. It asks him to choose truth. So if you are wondering why he changes right before union, this is where the answer begins. He changes because union cannot receive the old version of him. The old version could desire it, dream about it, miss it, even suffer because of it. But only the transformed version can hold it. Only the version who has been broken open by truth. Only the version who has stopped worshiping fear. Only the version who has learned that sacred love is not asking him to become perfect, but asking him to become real. That is the man union calls forward. And that is why before union arrives on the outside, something inside him must be reborn. Because the love may have always been destined. But the man who enters it must still be made ready by truth. Chapter 2: Why he often resists change until the final threshold. One of the most painful questions on this journey is this. If he feels the connection so deeply, why does he wait so long to change? Why does the divine masculine often resist the very transformation his soul clearly needs? Why does he delay truth, delay vulnerability, delay surrender? Delay the life that would actually bring him peace? Why does the shift so often happen late, sometimes painfully late, right before union, right before loss becomes irreversible, right before everything seems to reach its most intense breaking point? Because many divine masculines do not change when truth first appears. They change when resistance stops working. That is the final threshold. And this is one of the deepest truths of the masculine awakening process. He may feel the call for a long time, but still remain loyal to the self that helped him survive. He may know something sacred is happening. He may be profoundly shaken by the connection. He may privately understand that this bond is unlike anything he has known before. But understanding the truth and surrendering to it are not the same thing. Surrender costs him something. It costs pride. It costs image. It costs control. It costs the old version of masculinity that says he must stay composed, guarded, unaffected, and in charge of his emotional world at all times. And that is why he resists. Not because the connection is not real. Not because the love is not deep enough. But because the self he has built cannot cross into union unchanged. Still, the false self does not know that. The false self believes resistance is wisdom. It believes hesitation is safety. It believes delay is strategy. It believes if he waits long enough, thinks long enough, distances himself long enough, perhaps the emotional intensity will settle and he can return to the version of himself that felt more manageable. But the soul does not work that way. The soul keeps pressing, quietly at first, then more forcefully, then relentlessly. It presses through longing, through discomfort, through synchronicities, through emotional unrest, through the constant return of what he tried to put aside, through the feeling that no matter how much he tries to stay in control, something deeper is pulling at him and refusing to be dismissed. Still, many divine masculines resist. Why? Because the threshold of real change is terrifying. It is one thing to feel deeply in private. It is another thing to become someone who lives according to what he feels. That is a much greater demand. Living according to truth means he can no longer hide behind confusion. No longer call fear timing. No longer use silence as a shield. No longer let distance speak where honesty is required. No longer say he values love while continuing to serve the defenses that sabotage it. The final threshold is where all of this becomes impossible to ignore. And until he reaches that threshold, he often keeps negotiating. He negotiates with the truth, with his pain, with his conscience, with the connection, with the version of himself he knows is beginning to die. He tells himself, "Not yet. I need more time. I need more certainty. I need to get my life together first. I need to understand this more clearly. I need less pressure. I need less intensity." But beneath all of that is a simpler and harder truth. He is not ready to lose the identity that helped him feel safe. That is what resistance protects. Not always comfort. Sometimes misery that has become familiar. Patterns that have become identity. Defenses that no longer bring peace but still feel less terrifying than transformation. Human beings do this all the time. They stay in what hurts because it is known. They cling to what is empty because it is structured. They avoid the sacred because the sacred demands vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like death to the ego. This is why so many divine masculines wait until the final threshold. Because only there does the cost of staying the same become greater than the fear of changing. That is the turning point. Not when he first feels love. Not when he first notices the bond. Not when he first understands that the divine feminine is different. But when the old life starts collapsing under the weight of its own insufficiency. When distance no longer soothes him. When silence no longer protects him. When control no longer stabilizes him. When pretending becomes more exhausting than truth. When the ache of remaining divided becomes stronger than the terror of becoming real. This is why change often comes late. Because the ego does not surrender while it still believes it can win. As long as the old defenses still seem to function, he will often keep them. As long as he can still survive in half-truth, half-presence, half-commitment, half-openness, he may continue living in that fragmented state. It may not feel good, but it feels familiar enough to maintain. But the final threshold destroys that illusion. Now the fragmentation is no longer sustainable. Now the contradiction hurts too much. Now the delay has consequences that can be felt in the body, the conscience, the soul. And this is where he begins to change. Not because he suddenly becomes wiser overnight, but because life leaves him no more room to keep hiding. This stage can look very messy from the outside. He may become more emotional, not less. More humbled, not more polished. More raw, more honest, more inwardly shaken. Sometimes he may even look like he is falling apart. And in a way, he is. Because the final threshold is not comfortable transformation. It is collapse of resistance. It is the moment when the old masculine self can no longer keep pretending it has a future built on fear. It is the moment when the soul forces a man to confront that the very patterns he called protection are now the patterns destroying his chance at the life he truly wants. That confrontation is brutal, because he must face not only love, he must face himself. He must face the ways he hid, the ways he delayed, the ways he used logic to protect fear, the ways he kept asking for more signs, more time, more certainty when what was really needed was courage. This is why the final threshold often feels like an inner reckoning. It is not just, I miss her. It is, I can no longer deny what my fear has been doing. That awareness changes everything. Because now love is no longer abstract. Now truth is no longer theoretical. Now the spiritual connection becomes a mirror of moral and emotional reality. What kind of man have I been? What have I been protecting? What have I been calling strength that is really fear? How much longer can I live like this and still respect my own soul? These are threshold questions. And threshold questions do not let him sleep the same way anymore. This is why some divine masculines seem to awaken suddenly right before union. But the truth is, it is rarely truly sudden. More often, it is the result of long resistance finally breaking. The pressure has been building for a long time. The soul has been pressing for a long time. The pain has been speaking for a long time. The final threshold is simply the moment when he can no longer override it. That is why it can appear dramatic. Because from the outside, people see the shift. But they do not always see the years of inner conflict that came before it. The subtle collapses. The quiet regrets. The restless nights. The repeated moments when truth knocked and he still was not ready to answer. Then one day he is ready. Not because the fear is gone, but because the cost of fear has become undeniable. This matters deeply, because it means his resistance was never always proof that nothing was happening. Sometimes it was proof that something profound was happening. But he had not yet reached the point where surrender felt less terrifying than staying asleep. And eventually that point arrives. It arrives when his soul gets tired of compromise. When his body gets tired of carrying contradiction. When his conscience gets tired of watching him choose fear. When the possibility of losing something sacred becomes too real to keep treating as hypothetical. That is the final threshold. The place where excuses lose their power. Where delay loses its innocence. Where control loses its glamour. Where the old self is no longer impressive, only unbearable. And this is the sacred function of the threshold. It does not ask him whether he feels enough. It asks whether he is finally willing to let what is false die. Because until he does, union remains a concept he longs for but cannot inhabit. The final threshold turns longing into choice, into surrender, into embodiment. That is why he often resists until the end. Because the end is where the false self finally runs out of answers. And when that happens, something truer can begin. A softer man. A more honest man. A more accountable man. A man who no longer wants the appearance of control more than he wants the reality of love. A man who begins understanding that sacred union is not asking him to become perfect, only to stop betraying what his soul already knows. That is what the threshold does. It corners the old self until surrender becomes possible. And maybe that is the deepest truth of this chapter. He does not wait so long to change because the path is not real. He waits so long because real change asks for the death of everything he once believed kept him safe. And most men do not surrender that easily. They surrender when life shows them, unmistakably, that the old self cannot take them any farther. That is the final threshold. And that is why the change often happens there, right before union, right before truth becomes irreversible, right before the man who could only run begins turning into the man who can finally stay. Chapter 3: The Collapse of the Old Identity. Before union, something in him must fall apart. Not because he is being punished, not because the path is cruel, but because the version of him that once survived through fear cannot be the version of him that sustains sacred union. This is the hidden truth behind why he changes right before union. He changes because the old identity begins collapsing. And when that collapse begins, it rarely looks beautiful at first. It looks like confusion, like emotional instability, like inner contradiction, like silence that no longer feels safe, like control that no longer feels powerful, like a man who once seemed certain suddenly becoming deeply unsettled by truths he can no longer keep at a distance. Why? Because the old identity was never built for truth. It was built for survival. That distinction matters. The old identity may have helped him function, helped him achieve, helped him appear strong, capable, composed, independent, disciplined. But sacred love does not ask whether an identity is functional. It asks whether it is real. And many divine masculines, before awakening deepens, are living through identities that are efficient but not fully authentic. Identities shaped by old wounds, emotional conditioning, fear of vulnerability, the need for control, the need to stay unreadable, the need to never feel too much or reveal too much. These identities often look strong on the outside, but inside they are brittle. They depend on distance, on emotional management, on silence, on detachment masquerading as wisdom, on logic used not only for clarity, but for protection. And eventually, union puts pressure on all of it, because union is too honest for a false self. The old identity could survive in longing. It could survive in separation. It could survive in fantasy, avoidance, delay, and the half-light of almost. But when union draws near, the soul begins demanding something else. It demands congruence. No more split between what he feels and what he lives. No more split between inner knowing and outward avoidance. No more split between longing for truth and still protecting the lies that keep truth at a distance. This is when the old identity starts breaking down. He begins to feel the pressure of his own contradiction. He begins to see that what once looked like strength may have been self-protection. He begins to realize that the man he has been cannot carry him into the life his soul is asking for. And that realization is devastating. Because identity collapse does not just hurt emotionally. It hurts existentially. A man starts asking, who am I if I am no longer the one who stays in control? Who am I if I cannot keep hiding behind silence? Who am I if detachment is not actually peace? Who am I if the very traits I depended on were shaped more by fear than truth? Who am I if I stop being the one who runs? These are not small questions. They threaten the entire structure of self. And that is why the collapse is so intense right before union. Because he is not only moving closer to love, he is moving closer to the death of the self who could not hold love without distorting it. The achiever begins collapsing. The avoider begins collapsing. The emotionally guarded man begins collapsing. The controller begins collapsing. The one who survives by appearing unaffected begins collapsing. All of these parts start losing power at once. Not necessarily all at once in visible behavior, but inwardly, yes. Their authority weakens. Their glamour fades. Their promises stop sounding convincing. Why? Because they are no longer working. The achiever may still perform, but performance no longer fills the emptiness. The avoider may still withdraw, but distance no longer brings relief. The guarded man may still go silent, but silence no longer feels powerful. The controller may still try to manage everything, but control no longer restores peace. This is what identity collapse feels like. The old strategies still exist, but they no longer save him. And once that begins, he is in dangerous territory. Dangerous to the ego. Dangerous to the false self. Dangerous to every internal structure that was built to keep him from becoming too vulnerable, too exposed, too emotionally real. This is why he may look more chaotic right before union, not less. Because the old identity often breaks before the new one stabilizes. He may feel softer but less sure. More honest but more raw. More emotionally present, but also more shaken by what presence requires. He may feel like he is losing himself when, in truth, he is losing the version of himself that was built around not having to feel fully. That is the collapse. And it is holy. Messy, yes. Painful, yes. But holy. Because without this collapse, union would be entered by the wrong self. And the wrong self cannot sustain what the soul has been preparing. The false self wants love without vulnerability. Union requires vulnerability. The false self wants closeness without accountability. Union requires accountability. The false self wants emotional safety through control. Union requires truth deeper than control. The false self wants to be admired without being fully known. Union requires being known. So something false must die. That is the brutal mercy of this chapter. A man does not step into sacred union by adding spiritual language to the same old defenses. He does not arrive there by becoming a more self-aware version of avoidance. He does not reach that threshold by learning how to manage appearances better. He reaches it when the old self becomes intolerable. When pretending feels heavier than honesty. When silence feels heavier than confession. When the distance between who he is and who he is meant to become begins hurting too much to carry. This is where the collapse becomes irreversible. Because once he has truly seen the old identity for what it is, he cannot fully return to it in innocence. He may still try. He may still backslide. He may still grasp for familiar defenses. But they no longer feel neutral. Now they feel costly, hollow, spiritually expensive. That is a major shift. Before, the old identity felt protective. Now it feels imprisoning. Before, it felt like who he was. Now it starts feeling like something he inherited, performed, or built out of old pain. This awareness changes everything. Because now the man who once said, "This is just how I am," starts realizing, "No, this is how I learned to survive. This is not necessarily who I am beneath the wound." That is where the new masculine begins emerging. Not fully formed yet. Not polished. Not effortless. But emerging. The new masculine is not based on emotional exile. He is based on presence. Not based on image. Based on integrity. Not based on control. Based on grounded truth. Not based on being hard to read. Based on being honest enough that he no longer needs to disappear behind confusion, pride, or silence. But he cannot become that man while still worshiping the old identity. So the old identity collapses first. This is why the pre-union phase is often so intense for the divine masculine. He is not just approaching love. He is approaching the end of the self that could not yet live in love without fear dominating the inner world. He is standing in the ashes of who he was taught to be and sensing, maybe for the first time, that the man beneath that training is trying to rise. That rising is not smooth. Because grief comes with it. Shame sometimes comes with it. Regret comes with it. The realization of what he almost lost comes with it. The terrifying freedom of no longer being able to pretend comes with it. All of this can make him look destabilized. But what if destabilization is exactly what is needed? What if the old identity must lose coherence before the soul can reorder him around something truer? That is what is happening here. The collapse is not failure. It is preparation. Preparation for a version of masculinity that can actually sustain union. A version no longer organized around fear of vulnerability. A version no longer impressed by distance. A version no longer willing to sacrifice truth just to preserve control. This is why he changes right before union. Because by then, the old identity is finally breaking under the pressure of what union demands. No more masks. No more half-lives. No more inward truth with outward avoidance. No more surviving through the very patterns that keep love out. Now he must become different. Different in the way he feels. Different in the way he responds to discomfort. Different in the way he handles emotional truth. Different in the way he sees power, tenderness, and presence. And perhaps that is the real meaning of the collapse. He is not losing himself. He is losing everything that kept him from being himself. The guarded man. The running man. The controlling man. The one who mistook numbness for peace. The one who believed he needed armor to be masculine. The one who thought he could enter sacred love without being remade by it. That man cannot cross the threshold. But the man beneath him can. And so right before union, the old identity begins to crumble. Not because love is rejecting him. Because love is refusing to let him remain divided. That is the collapse. And that is the doorway. Chapter 4: Why Pain Becomes the Catalyst Right Before Union. There is a reason the deepest change often does not happen in comfort. It happens in pain. And this is especially true right before union. Because comfort allows the old self to survive. Pain does not. Comfort gives him room to delay. To rationalize. To remain half awake. To tell himself there is still time, still space, still another chance to avoid the deeper transformation without truly losing what matters. But pain removes that illusion. Pain forces contact. Contact with what he feels. With what he has avoided. With what his old identity has cost him. With the emotional truth that can no longer remain abstract once it begins burning through the body, the conscience, the soul. That is why pain becomes the catalyst right before union. Not because pain is the goal. Not because suffering is romantic. But because right before union, the soul needs more than longing. It needs surrender. And pain is often what finally breaks the structures that kept surrender from happening. This is one of the hardest truths to understand on the twin flame journey. People often imagine that if union is near, things should become smoother, lighter, more obviously peaceful. They expect signs of calm, signs of easy return, signs of external harmony. But many times the opposite happens first. Everything intensifies. The ache deepens. The silence becomes heavier. The regrets sharpen. The loneliness becomes undeniable. The old coping mechanisms stop working. And the divine masculine begins feeling what he has spent so long trying not to feel. Why? Because pain strips away the luxury of delay. As long as he can remain emotionally protected without feeling the full cost of it, he may continue doing so. As long as distance still offers some illusion of control, he may keep choosing it. As long as his old identity still feels functional enough to survive day by day, he may continue living from it. But pain changes the equation. Pain makes the old self expensive. The silence that once felt safe starts feeling empty. The distance that once felt powerful starts feeling unbearable. The control that once made him feel strong starts feeling exhausting. The logic that once protected him starts sounding thin in the face of what his heart already knows. This is the beginning of the catalyst. Pain turns the consequences of his inner division into something tangible. No longer theory. No longer spiritual language. No longer a vague knowing that something is happening. Now it is visceral. He feels it in his chest, in his restlessness, in the ache of what he almost lost, in the emotional fatigue of staying guarded, in the unbearable truth that his old ways are no longer preserving him. They are draining him. This is why pain often appears to intensify right before union, because the soul is bringing everything hidden to the surface. The unprocessed grief, the fear of intimacy, the old shame, the consequences of pride, the loneliness beneath the mask, the pain of realizing that he may have come dangerously close to losing something sacred because he was still trying to survive through fear. That kind of pain is catalytic, because it breaks denial. A man can explain away longing. He can intellectualize a connection. He can tell himself he needs more time. But when pain becomes deep enough, explanation is no longer enough. The body does not care that he has good reasons. The heart does not calm down because the timing was complicated. The soul does not go back to sleep because the ego wants another delay. Pain forces honesty where logic once allowed negotiation. This is why right before union, the masculine often begins facing himself in ways he never had to before. Not because he suddenly becomes wiser in the abstract, but because pain has removed the comfort of staying unconscious. He can no longer comfortably hide behind old stories. He can no longer pretend that what is happening is only about circumstance. He can no longer act as if his suffering is unrelated to the patterns he keeps choosing. Now the truth is personal, and personal truth changes a man faster than philosophy ever will. That is why heartbreak, separation, regret, loneliness, and emotional exhaustion often gather so strongly before the breakthrough. These are not always signs that the path is failing. Sometimes they are signs that the old self is reaching its limit, that the soul is pressing harder, that the final resistance is being confronted. What does pain do in this phase? It humbles him. Pain makes him feel the weight of what he cannot control. It exposes the fact that control was never as powerful as he imagined. It shows him that emotional distance cannot protect him from everything, especially not from the truth of his own soul. Pain also softens him. Not instantly. Not gracefully. Sometimes pain makes him harder at first, more defensive, more withdrawn, more determined to keep holding himself together. But if the process continues, pain eventually begins to soften the places pride once ruled. It opens cracks in the armor. It makes tenderness unavoidable. It brings him face to face with the fact that beneath all the strength he performed, there is still a human heart that wants to stop hiding. And pain matures him. Because pain does not only say, "You are hurting." It asks, "What now?" Will he keep choosing the same defenses and call it wisdom? Will he keep delaying truth and call it timing? Will he keep using distance as protection when distance is now part of the wound? Will he keep waiting for union without becoming someone who can actually hold it? These are catalytic questions. They force the masculine out of fantasy and into reality. This is why the pre-union pain can feel so merciless. Because it is not just emotional discomfort. It is a threshold fire. It burns through illusion. It burns through self-deception. It burns through old strategies. It burns through the pride that says, "I can keep living like this a little longer." No. Right before union, pain often says, "You cannot. You cannot keep protecting the wound more than the truth. You cannot keep asking love to wait while fear remains your God. You cannot keep wanting union while remaining loyal to the self that sabotages it. That message hurts. But it is sacred, because pain in this phase is not only taking something from him, it is preparing him to become someone else. Someone more honest, more accountable, more present, more emotionally real, more willing to let truth cost him what falsehood once preserved. That transformation rarely begins in ease. Ease comforts the current structure. Pain destabilizes it. And if the current structure is built around avoidance, fear, and emotional exile, then destabilization is not the enemy. It is the doorway. This is why so many divine masculines seem to change only when everything reaches the edge. Only when the consequences of their own resistance become too sharp to keep calling manageable. Only when they are forced to feel the difference between merely wanting love and being made ready by pain to finally live in alignment with it. The catalyst is not always external. Sometimes nothing dramatic happens outwardly. No huge event. No obvious ending. No public collapse. Sometimes the pain is internal. A private exhaustion. A breaking in the chest. A deepening grief. A relentless feeling that the old life no longer fits. A quiet knowing that if he keeps choosing the same patterns, he will lose not only the connection, but his own self-respect. That kind of pain is enough, because it is no longer about the appearance of loss. It is about the experience of misalignment. And misalignment becomes unbearable right before union, because union itself is alignment. The soul begins preparing him for a reality in which what he feels and how he lives can no longer remain separate. And every place where they are still separate begins to hurt more intensely. That is why the pain is not random. It is showing him where the old self still lives, where fear still speaks louder than truth, where pride still overrides tenderness, where emotional immaturity still interrupts what the soul is trying to build. Pain reveals all of that by making it impossible to live with lightly. And maybe that is the deepest reason pain becomes the catalyst right before union. Because union is not a prize for longing. It is a state that requires integrity. And integrity often rises only after pain has made dishonesty unbearable. When the masculine finally feels, in a way he cannot escape, the cost of his own emotional exile. When he finally understands that the ache is not only about missing her, but about meeting himself. When he finally realizes that the pain is not simply punishment, but preparation. That is when the change begins becoming real. Not performative. Not temporary. Real. Because now he is not just moving toward her. He is being forced through the fire that makes him capable of meeting her differently. That is the catalyst. Pain is not there because he is cursed. Pain is there because the old self has reached its limit. And when the old self can no longer survive the truth, a new man begins to emerge. That man is softer, but not weaker. More vulnerable, but more grounded. Less defended, more honest. Less invested in image, more devoted to alignment. And that is exactly why pain becomes the catalyst right before union. Because the man who enters union is often born in the very fire the old man tried so hard to avoid. Chapter 5: The Divine Feminine stops chasing, and the mirror sharpens. There comes a point on the journey when the divine feminine gets tired. Not always tired of loving. Not always tired of hoping. Not always tired of the connection itself. But tired of carrying what was never hers to carry. Tired of reaching, explaining, overextending, intuiting, holding space, making excuses, reading the silence, translating mixed signals, and trying to keep the bridge alive through sheer emotional labor. And when that happens, something profound shifts. She stops chasing. Not always dramatically. Not always with anger. Not always with a final declaration. Sometimes the shift is quiet. She simply returns to herself. She stops forcing conversations that are not being met. She stops overfunctioning in the name of love. She stops confusing devotion with self-abandonment. She stops trying to be the emotional engine of a connection that requires two souls, not one exhausted heart, to move forward. And when she does, the mirror sharpens. This is one of the most misunderstood turning points before union. Because many people assume the divine feminine stepping back means the connection is weakening. They assume that if she stops chasing, the bond must be fading. That if she becomes quieter, more self-contained, more rooted in her own path, then perhaps she has stopped caring. But that is not always what is happening at all. Sometimes, for the first time, she is loving without distortion. She is no longer loving from fear. No longer loving from lack. No longer loving from the wounded belief that she must do more, give more, wait harder, hold more pain, and abandon herself just to keep something sacred alive. And that shift changes everything. Because as long as she is chasing, the masculine can remain partially asleep. He can keep leaning on her energy without fully realizing it. He can keep receiving her emotional labor while avoiding his own transformation. He can keep staying in between worlds, not fully choosing, because part of the connection is still being carried for him. But when she stops, he is left alone with the mirror, and the mirror becomes brutal in its clarity. Now there is no one translating his silence into hidden love. No one constantly softening the consequences of his distance. No one energetically overcompensating for his hesitation. No one carrying the emotional weight he was meant to confront himself. Now he has to face what remains when her pursuit is gone. His own choices, his own fears, his own inconsistency, his own emptiness, his own soul. That is why the mirror sharpens. Because the feminine withdrawal of wounded chasing removes distortion from the field. Before, he may have still been able to hide behind the comfort of her availability. Even if she was hurt, even if she was exhausted, even if things were unstable, there was still a part of him that knew the connection remained emotionally padded by her effort. Her energy kept reaching. Her heart kept holding. Her soul kept making room. But once that changes, the emotional reality becomes cleaner. Now he must feel the absence of what he took for granted. Now he must feel the weight of what he did not meet. Now he must sit in the silence without her overextending to rescue him from it. And that can become one of the most catalytic moments right before union. Because it is often here that the divine masculine finally begins to understand the difference between being loved and being carried. This matters deeply. Being loved is sacred. Being carried indefinitely by someone else's emotional labor is not union. And sometimes the masculine does not fully realize how much of the connection's movement was being sustained by the feminine until that sustaining force withdraws. Not out of punishment, not out of manipulation, but out of alignment. She chooses herself. She chooses dignity. She chooses healing. She chooses to stop mothering a soul who is being called into his own adulthood. And in doing so, she becomes an even more powerful mirror. Because now she reflects what truth looks like without overreaching. She reflects self-respect, self-containment, emotional sobriety, inner devotion that does not beg, love that does not collapse into self-betrayal. That kind of mirror can shake him more than pursuit ever did. Why? Because wounded chasing can be misread by the masculine ego. It can feel comforting, flattering, familiar. It can even allow him to stay somewhat passive, because the energy is still coming toward him. But when the feminine becomes still, clear, and self-honoring, something else happens. Now he cannot hide from the gap. The gap between what he feels and what he has done. The gap between the love available to him and the man he has been willing to be. The gap between her self-respect and his avoidance. the gap between sacred connection and his old coping mechanisms. That gap becomes unbearable right before union. Because now the mirror is no longer blurred by emotional chasing. It is exact. And exact mirrors are painful. They do not flatter the false self. They do not soothe avoidance. They do not reward half-presence. They reveal. They reveal where he has delayed, where he has hidden, where he has confused silence with depth, where he has relied on the feminine to keep feeling for both of them, where he has wanted the connection while resisting the responsibility of becoming someone who can truly meet it. This is why the feminine stopping the chase often becomes part of the final catalyst. Not because she is playing a role to trigger him, but because truth itself becomes louder when distortion is removed. And chasing, when it comes from wounded overgiving, can become distortion. It can mask the real state of the connection. It can cushion the masculine from the full emotional consequence of his choices. It can create movement that looks like love, but is actually imbalance. When that stops, imbalance becomes visible. And visibility changes things. Because now, if he feels the bond, he must face it without her doing the labor of keeping it alive for him. If he misses her, he must sit with missing her instead of unconsciously depending on her continued reaching to reassure him. If he knows what she is, what the connection is, what the soul is asking, then he must confront that truth in an unbuffered form. This is the sharpening, and it often hurts. It hurts him because now he can feel the space where her energy used to meet him. It hurts her because pulling back, even when it is healthy, can still ache. It hurts the old pattern because the old pattern depended on imbalance to survive. But pain is often what reveals what was never sustainable. And what was never sustainable here? A feminine who keeps abandoning herself so the masculine does not have to face himself. That cannot lead to sacred union. It can lead to longing, to lessons, to repetitive cycles, to spiritual exhaustion. But union demands something truer. It demands that she become anchored enough to stop chasing from wounded energy. And it demands that he become honest enough to move without needing to be pulled. That is why this phase is so important. Because when the feminine stops chasing, the masculine finally comes into contact with something many of his old patterns were designed to avoid. Unmanaged reality. No one softening it. No one rescuing him from it. No one carrying the emotional current for both souls. Just reality. Reality says, she is no longer overextending. Reality says, you cannot keep staying passive without feeling the consequences now. Reality says, if you want sacred love, you must become someone who can meet it without requiring her to diminish herself first. This is the threshold message. And many divine masculines only begin changing deeply when they reach this point. When they realize the feminine's energy is no longer available in the old way. When they realize her love is still sacred, but it is no longer chasing them through their defenses. When they realize they may actually have to cross the distance themselves, emotionally, spiritually, inwardly, without being dragged by her longing. That realization can awaken enormous grief. Because now he feels what her pursuit once buffered him from. The weight of his own delay. He feels the stillness, the absence, the sharpened consequence of hesitation. The terrifying possibility that sacred love is not something he can keep assuming will remain in the same form while he figures himself out forever. And this is where conscience begins deepening. Not abstract conscience. Embodied conscience. The kind that says, I see what she was doing. I see what I was not doing. I see how much space she held. I see how little I truly met it. I see that her stepping back is not cruelty. It is truth. That realization changes a man. Because the mirror is no longer asking whether he feels deeply. It is asking whether he is finally willing to become real. That is the sharper mirror. And perhaps this is the hidden grace of the feminine shift. When she stops chasing, she does not kill the connection. She stops distorting it. She lets it reveal itself. If the masculine truly feels it, he will now have to face it without the comfort of imbalance. If he truly wants union, he will now have to become someone who can move toward it from truth, not merely from reaction to her effort. If he truly loves, he will now have to discover whether that love can mature into action, responsibility, and presence. This is why the feminine's withdrawal from wounded chasing is often one of the last sacred pressures before union. Because it clears the field. It ends illusion. It ends emotional overcompensation. It ends the pattern in which one soul keeps bleeding while the other keeps delaying. Now both are brought to truth. She is brought to herself. He is brought to the mirror. And once the mirror sharpens, the old masculine identity begins running out of places to hide. That is when change becomes more possible than ever before. Not because she forced it, but because she stopped preventing it by carrying what was never hers to carry. And that may be one of the deepest truths of all. Sometimes the feminine moves union closer, not by doing more, but by finally doing less of what kept him from facing himself. Chapter 6: Why he starts feeling the weight of what he almost lost. There is a moment before union when something becomes painfully clear to him. This connection is not guaranteed in the way his old self once assumed. And that realization changes everything. Because for a long time, many divine masculines live as though what is sacred will somehow remain suspended in time while they delay, avoid, hesitate, and keep negotiating with their own fear. Not always consciously, not with cruelty, but with the quiet assumption that what is real will still be there later. That the bond can wait while they figure themselves out. That the feminine heart will continue holding space. That the connection, because it is deep, will somehow survive indefinitely without requiring a different version of them. But right before union, that illusion often breaks. And when it breaks, he begins feeling the weight of what he almost lost. Not as an idea. Not as a spiritual concept. Not as some abstract fear of missing out. He feels it in the body, in the conscience, in the soul, in the unbearable pressure of realizing that something sacred was never meant to be endlessly postponed while he remained unchanged. This is one of the deepest turning points in the journey, because a man can ignore longing for a long time. He can rationalize it, minimize it, compartmentalize it. He can tell himself the connection is too much, too complicated, too inconvenient, too intense. He can keep one foot outside of truth while still privately sensing how much it matters. But when he begins to feel the real possibility of loss, the meaning becomes personal. Now it is no longer. This connection affects me. Now it becomes. I may actually lose the chance to meet this truth in the form I kept assuming would always remain available. That is devastating, because the heart responds differently when sacred love becomes fragile in a way the ego can no longer deny. Before, he could still hide behind time. Now time feels sharp. Before, he could still hide behind distance. Now distance feels dangerous. Before, he could still imagine that his inner feelings were enough. Now he is forced to confront the possibility that unspoken truth, unchosen truth, can still lead to real consequences. That is where the weight begins. And the weight is not only about losing her. It is about seeing himself clearly. Seeing where he delayed. Where he hid. Where he used confusion as a shield. Where he leaned on the existence of the bond while resisting the transformation required to honor it. Where he treated something sacred as though it could wait forever for the version of him who still was not ready to show up fully. This is why the almost loss is so catalytic. Because it awakens conscience. Not performative guilt. Not shallow panic. Not temporary emotional intensity. Conscience. the deeper knowing that says, this mattered more than I admitted. This was more real than I allowed myself to act like. I came closer than I realized to losing something my soul knows is sacred. And the reason it nearly slipped away was not only timing, it was the man I was still being. That is an unbearable truth for the old self. Because the old self survives through explanation. It says, you had reasons. You needed time. You were overwhelmed. You were trying to be practical. You were not ready. But the conscience that awakens right before union says something else. And still look at what your fear almost cost you. That sentence can break a man open. Because now the issue is no longer simply whether he feels love. The issue is whether he can continue respecting the self who kept asking love to remain patient while fear ran the decisions. This is where the emotional weight becomes holy. Because it is not just pain. It is the collapse of innocence. He can no longer pretend his delays were neutral. He can no longer pretend his silence carried no consequence. He can no longer pretend that because the bond was spiritual, it was exempt from the laws of emotional truth. No. Sacred things can still be wounded by hesitation. Deep love can still be strained by fear. Soul recognition can still be mishandled by a man who has not yet become able to live according to what he knows. And when he sees that truly sees it, his entire inner world begins shifting. Why? Because the almost lost does what comfort never could. It makes the cost visible. As long as the connection feels safely there, he can remain partly asleep. But when he senses that the feminine has changed, the energy has shifted, the bridge is no longer being carried in the same way. Or the possibility of losing this version of the bond becomes real. He is forced into a deeper contact with his own truth. Now he feels urgency. Not frantic, egoic urgency necessarily, but soul urgency. The kind that says, I cannot keep telling myself there is endless time. I cannot keep standing at the edge of truth while calling that enough. I cannot keep loving inwardly while living outwardly in contradiction. I cannot keep assuming something sacred will remain untouched by my avoidance forever. This is why many divine masculines begin changing more quickly once they feel what they almost lost. Because almost lost pierces denial. It strips away the luxury of abstraction. It forces the emotional body to register what the mind kept negotiating around. It makes him feel not only the beauty of the connection, but the fragility of opportunity. And opportunity matters here. Not because union is scarce in a fearful way, but because each soul-level opening asks to be met in truth while it is alive. A man cannot keep betraying his own soul and assume the path will feel the same forever. He may still be loved. The bond may still be real. The spiritual truth may still stand. But the form of the opportunity changes when fear is chosen too many times. And somewhere deep down, the divine masculine begins sensing this right before union. He senses that this is no longer a phase where he can stay passive without consequence. He senses that the feminine is no longer available in the old wounded dynamic. He senses that the soul is no longer willing to let him live in delay, while pretending delay is harmless. That realization is sobering. And sobriety is often what precedes real union. Because sobriety removes fantasy. Fantasy says, it will all work out eventually without me changing that much. Fantasy says, the feeling itself is enough. Fantasy says, if it is meant to be, I can stay emotionally half present and destiny will handle the rest. But sobered truth says, no. What is meant for you still asks something of you. What is sacred still requires integrity. What is real still asks to be met by a real version of you. This is why he starts feeling the weight right before union. Because union is near enough that the soul sharpens his awareness of the stakes. Not material stakes. Spiritual ones. Emotional ones. Character level stakes. What kind of man will he be at the edge of something sacred? The one who delays again? The one who hides again? The one who lets fear decide again? Or the one who finally allows the almost lost to become the moment that makes truth unavoidable? That is the deeper question of this chapter. And it is not easy. Because feeling the weight of what he almost lost also means feeling grief for the version of himself that almost let it happen. It means facing the ache of wasted time, missed honesty, withheld truth, unnecessary distance. It means seeing how close he came to letting something holy pass by while he was still trying to protect an identity built on fear. That hurts in a very specific way. It is not only heartbreak. It is reckoning. Reckoning with who he has been. Reckoning with what love required. Reckoning with the fact that spiritual connection does not remove the need for courage. It intensifies it. This is why the pre-union phase often carries such emotional gravity. Because he is not only waking up to the connection, he is waking up to consequence. And consequence can mature a man quickly when he is finally ready to let it teach him. He starts feeling more tenderness because he now knows what almost slipped through his hands. He starts feeling more humility because pride no longer looks impressive against the possibility of sacred loss. He starts feeling more responsibility because the story can no longer remain only about circumstances. Now it is also about him, his choices, his fear, his hesitation, his soul, his willingness or unwillingness to become the man who can finally stop treating truth like something he can always answer later. That is the weight. And strange as it sounds, this weight is a gift. A painful gift. A sobering gift. A deeply humbling gift. But a gift. Because the weight of what he almost lost often becomes the final pressure that turns longing into decision. That turns emotional awareness into accountability. That turns one day into, I cannot keep doing this to my soul. This is when change stops being vague. Now it becomes necessary. Necessary because he has seen too much. Felt too much. Almost lost too much. And once a man truly feels that, the old self begins running out of excuses. That is why he starts changing right before union. Because he is no longer just dreaming of what the connection could be. He is grieving what it nearly ceased to be because of who he was still being. That grief breaks something open. And through that opening, a more honest masculine can finally begin to rise. A man who does not want to wait for total loss before becoming truthful. A man who stops assuming sacred love will remain in the same form while he avoids transformation. A man who understands, maybe for the first time, that almost losing something holy is sometimes the very thing that teaches him how holy it really was. And perhaps that is the deepest truth here. He changes right before union, because right before union, he finally feels the full weight of what fear nearly took from him. Not to punish him, to wake him, to make him see, to make him choose. To make him understand that sacred love is not only something to feel, but something to honor before it becomes a lesson in what he let slip away. That is the weight. And that is what changes him. Chapter 7: The shift from wanting love to becoming able to hold it. There is a profound difference between wanting union and being able to sustain it. And that difference is exactly why he changes right before union. Because for much of the journey, the divine masculine may already want the connection. He may miss her, think about her, feel drawn to her, dream of her, ache for her, even quietly love her in ways he does not fully know how to express. The longing may be real. The desire may be real. The bond may be undeniable. But longing is not the same as capacity. Desire is not the same as embodiment. And sacred union does not happen simply because he wants love badly enough. It happens when he becomes someone who can hold love without collapsing back into the old patterns that once made union impossible. That is the shift. At first, he wants the feeling. Later, he begins developing the structure to live inside the truth of that feeling. Those are two very different stages. A man can want her and still disappear. He can want union and still choose avoidance. He can feel love deeply and still not know how to stay open when vulnerability rises. He can ache for closeness and still sabotage closeness the moment it starts becoming real. Why? Because wanting love is emotional. Holding love is spiritual, psychological, and relational maturity. Holding love means he can stay when fear is activated. Holding love means he can tell the truth before silence becomes damage. Holding love means he no longer needs distance to regulate every intense feeling. Holding love means he has built the capacity to remain present, accountable, and emotionally real when the connection asks more of him than longing from afar. This is why right before union, something deeper begins changing in him. He is no longer only wrestling with whether he wants her. He is being forced to confront whether he is capable of meeting what she represents without betraying it. That question changes the entire path. Because the old masculine self often lives in a fantasy that feeling is enough. That if the connection is deep enough, if the desire is strong enough, if the love is meant to be, then somehow the rest will take care of itself. But sacred union does not work that way. Love may be given. Capacity must be built. And many divine masculines spend years on the path, confusing the two. They feel deeply, so they assume something important is happening. And they are right. Something important is happening. But feeling deeply is only the beginning. Feeling awakens the heart. It does not automatically heal the nervous system, mature emotional habits, soften pride, dissolve avoidance, or build the ability to stay present under pressure. That work comes later, often painfully later. And right before union, that difference becomes impossible to ignore. Now he can feel that wanting her is no longer enough. Missing her is no longer enough. Understanding the connection is no longer enough. Even suffering over it is no longer enough. He must become someone different. Someone who can tell the truth instead of hiding behind timing. Someone who can repair instead of retreating into ego. Someone who can stay grounded when emotion rises instead of fleeing into silence. Someone who can hold intimacy without making it responsible for all the parts of him still unhealed. That is the real pre-union transformation. Not does he want her, but can he hold what union actually requires? This is where the path becomes much more confronting, because it asks him to see that longing can be immature, not false, not meaningless, but incomplete. Longing can still center him. His pain, his wanting, his hunger, his fear of loss, his fantasy of reunion. But holding love asks him to center truth. Truth says, can you be honest? Can you be consistent? Can you be accountable? Can you remain present when something sacred asks more of you than intensity? Can you love without using your wounds as an excuse to stay half available? That is a higher standard, and union demands it. Because union is not just emotional closeness. It is energetic congruence. It is the moment where what he feels and what he lives can no longer remain separate without consequence. It is the end of being one man inwardly and another man outwardly. It is the end of privately knowing while publicly avoiding. It is the end of craving sacred love while still serving the patterns that sabotage sacred love. This is why the masculine often changes right before union, because he is being forced out of desire and into capacity. And capacity is built through very specific inner shifts. He begins telling the truth faster. He becomes less comfortable with excuses. He starts seeing how his old behaviors damage what he claims to value. He becomes more emotionally sober, more aware of consequence, more willing to sit in discomfort without immediately escaping it. These changes may not look dramatic at first. They may be quiet, a softer tone, a deeper honesty, less performance, less arrogance, more humility, more conscience, more willingness to admit what he feels without packaging it into something safe and detached. But beneath those visible changes is something much bigger. He is becoming able to hold what he once could only desire from a distance. That is sacred, because the man who only wants love still makes love serve his need. The man who can hold love begins serving truth. The man who only wants love says, "I miss her." The man who can hold love says, "I must stop being someone who wounds what he loves through fear." The man who only wants union says, "I hope this happens." The man who can hold union says, "I must become someone who can meet this fully when it does." That is the shift. And it is why the final phase before union is often so intense. He is not simply getting closer to her. He is being asked to become emotionally and spiritually capable of what closeness will demand. That means the places where he is still weak, still avoidant, still immature, still defended, still fragmented, all begin surfacing more sharply. Because they cannot cross the threshold unchanged. Union does not only bless love, it exposes weakness. Not to shame him, to prepare him. If he still lies to himself, union will bring pressure to that lie. If he still fears vulnerability, union will intensify that fear until it must be faced. If he still wants connection without responsibility, union will reveal how unsustainable that is. That is why the final preparation can feel so raw. He is being made ready. And being made ready often means losing the identities that could only want love, but not protect it, nourish it, or stay in integrity with it. This is the death of fantasy masculinity. The version that confuses intensity with readiness. The version that believes soul connection excuses emotional immaturity. The version that thinks deep feeling is enough to sustain a sacred bond. No. Feeling may begin the path. Capacity completes it. That is why so many divine masculines seem to awaken most deeply at the final stretch. It is not just that they suddenly realize what the connection means. Often they knew for a long time. What changes is that they begin realizing what the connection requires. And that realization matures them. Because once a man truly sees that union is not just about getting what he wants, but about becoming who can honor what he wants, everything changes. Now he is no longer asking only, "How do I get closer to her?" Now he is asking, "What in me still cannot hold truth steadily? Where do I still collapse into fear? What must die in me so I stop betraying what I love? How do I become someone whose presence is safe for sacred love to land in?" Those are capacity questions. And they are the signs of a masculine who is moving toward real readiness. Because readiness is not emotional intensity. It is inner architecture. A stronger nervous system. A softer heart. A more honest tongue. A less defended ego. A deeper reverence for what love actually asks. This is why the final shift before union is so holy. He is no longer just the man who feels. He is becoming the man who can carry truth, carry intimacy, carry remorse without hiding, carry vulnerability without turning it into shame, carry love without needing to sabotage it to feel in control. That is sacred masculine growth. Not flashy, not performative, not loud, but real. And perhaps that is the deepest truth of this chapter. He changes right before union, because union is the moment when wanting is no longer enough. At the edge of sacred love, desire must become devotion. Longing must become integrity. Emotional intensity must become capacity. And the man who enters union is often not the same man who spent years only aching for it. He is softer now, truer now, more accountable now, more able to remain, more able to hold the weight, beauty, and responsibility of what he once only knew how to miss. That is the shift. From wanting love to becoming able to hold it. And that is why everything changes right before union. Chapter 8 signs he is changing right before union. There is a difference between a man being emotional and a man actually changing. A difference between temporary softness and real transformation. A difference between missing you and becoming someone who can finally meet you. A difference between feeling the connection more intensely and truly allowing that intensity to reshape his character. That difference matters deeply right before union. Because many divine masculines feel. Many ache. Many think about the connection constantly. Many experience inner conflict, longing, regret, dreams, synchronicities, emotional pressure, and the collapse of the old self. But none of those things, by themselves, guarantee that he is ready. So how do you know something real is shifting in him right before union? You know because the change begins showing up not only in how deeply he feels, but in how differently he responds to truth. That is the key. A man changing right before union does not simply become more emotional. He becomes more honest, more accountable, more humbled, more internally aligned, more capable of staying with what he once ran from. And there are signs. Not perfect signs. Not always loud signs. Not always immediate signs. But unmistakable ones. The first sign is this. 1. He stops hiding behind excuses. For a long time, the old masculine self survives through explanation. The timing was wrong. Life was complicated. He needed space. He was overwhelmed. He was confused. He had too much going on. He was trying to think clearly. And maybe some of that was true. But right before union, those explanations begin losing power inside him. Not just in conversation. In conscience. He starts hearing the thinness of his own excuses. He begins realizing that what he once called confusion was often fear. What he once called timing was sometimes delay. What he once called needing space was sometimes his old self trying to avoid what truth was asking of him. This is one of the clearest signs. Because when a man is truly changing, he no longer feels comfortable using words to protect the version of himself that is dying. He begins wanting truth more than explanation. That changes everything. 2. He becomes more honest, even when honesty costs him pride. The old self protects image. It wants to look composed, reasonable, unbothered, in control. But the masculine who is changing right before union begins valuing honesty more than appearance. That does not mean he becomes perfectly expressive overnight. It does not mean he suddenly knows how to communicate every feeling beautifully. But something shifts. He becomes less interested in preserving an image of control and more willing to admit what is actually happening inside him. He may begin acknowledging that he was afraid, that he cared more than he said, that he mishandled something important, that the connection never really left him, that the old version of him could not meet the truth properly. This kind of honesty is not polished. It is vulnerable, sometimes awkward, sometimes late, sometimes carrying grief. But it is real, and reality matters more than perfection right before union. 3. He feels the emotional impact of his actions. Before awakening matures, many men can feel pain without fully feeling consequence. They hurt, yes. They miss, yes. They think long, wonder, regret. But they may still remain slightly disconnected from how their choices affected the connection, the feminine, and their own soul. Right before union, that begins changing. Now he feels the weight of what he did not say, the weight of where he pulled away, the weight of where silence became harm, the weight of what pride nearly cost him. the weight of how much emotional labor the feminine carried while he stayed in hesitation. This is not just guilt. It is conscience becoming embodied. And conscience is one of the holiest signs of real change. Because once a man truly feels the impact of his actions, he can no longer remain neutral about who he has been. Now he must either become more honest or suffer more deeply under the contradiction. That is why this sign matters. It means numbness is breaking. 4. He stops romanticizing his distance. For a long time, the old masculine self may have believed that distance made him strong, that being hard to read gave him power, that staying quiet protected him, that keeping control of his emotions made him wise, that remaining detached made him mature. But when he is changing right before union, that illusion begins to collapse. Now distance no longer looks impressive to him. It looks lonely, expensive, spiritually exhausting. He starts seeing that what he once glorified as control was often fear. That what he once called peace was sometimes emotional shutdown. That what he once used to protect himself actually kept him from the very thing his soul wanted most. This is a huge sign. Because once a man stops admiring his defenses, the defenses start losing their throne. And that is when real readiness becomes possible. 5. He becomes softer without becoming weaker. This is one of the most beautiful signs right before union. The changing masculine often becomes softer. Not fragile in a broken way. Not passive. Not collapsed. Softer. More emotionally present. More reflective. More aware of tenderness. More affected by truth. More capable of letting the heart speak without instantly shutting it down. And yet at the same time, he often becomes more grounded. That is the sacred paradox. Because real transformation does not make him weaker. It makes him less defended. There is a difference. The old self was hard because it was afraid. The changing self becomes soft because it no longer wants fear to rule everything. That softness may show up in how he speaks, in how he listens, in how he no longer needs to dominate every emotional moment with silence or control, in how he starts carrying more reverence for what the connection really is. This softness is not temporary sentimentality. It is a sign that the soul is beginning to lead. 6. He starts choosing truth over ego. The ego always wants protection first. It wants to be right, to be safe, to preserve image, to avoid humiliation, to avoid emotional exposure. But right before union, the masculine who is truly changing begins making different choices. Not perfectly, but meaningfully. He starts choosing truth even when it wounds his pride. He starts seeing that his ego has cost him too much already. That appearing strong while living divided is no longer tolerable. That if he keeps protecting his image, he may lose the opportunity to live in alignment with what his soul already knows. This is one of the strongest signs of all. Because when truth becomes more important than ego, the old self is very close to collapsing completely. And something much more real is preparing to rise. 7. He becomes more consistent internally. Sometimes external change takes time to show. But inside, a major sign is that he becomes less split. Before, one part of him wanted union while another part wanted escape. One part wanted honesty while another part wanted delay. One part felt love while another part still worshipped control. Right before union, that inner split begins narrowing. He may still feel fear, but he becomes less available to living from it. He may still have doubts, but the deeper truth carries more authority now. He may still struggle, but he no longer fully believes in the old defenses the same way. This matters because union requires internal congruence before external congruence can truly stabilize. He begins wanting one thing in a more unified way. Truth. Truth in how he feels. truth in how he speaks, truth in how he shows up, truth in how he stops negotiating with his own soul. That inner consistency is a major sign that union energy is getting very close. 8. He no longer wants to merely feel the connection, he wants to honor it. This is perhaps the clearest sign of all. At earlier stages, he may want the feeling, the intensity, the comfort, the closeness, the spiritual beauty of the bond, the emotional significance of being loved at that level. But right before union, something matures. Now he wants to honor it. He wants to stop being casual with what is sacred. He wants to stop treating soul-level truth as something he can answer later. He wants his actions to match the depth of what he feels. He wants to become a man the connection does not have to survive in spite of. That is a profound change, because it means he is moving from receiving the connection emotionally to serving it through character. And union is built there, not only in love, in character refined by love. 9. He begins taking responsibility without being dragged there. A man who is not yet ready often needs truth forced on him. Circumstances corner him. Pain crushes him. Consequences pressure him. Other people name what he refuses to face. But right before union, the changing masculine begins moving toward responsibility on his own. He starts confessing internally, starts reflecting more honestly, starts seeing where he was asleep, starts owning what he has been. This is huge, because real union cannot be built with a man who only takes responsibility under pressure. It requires a man who has developed enough conscience to move toward truth, because he can no longer bear the weight of avoiding it. That is readiness, not perfection, but voluntary honesty. 10. He starts becoming the man union can trust. This is the deepest sign of all. Right before union, he is not just becoming more emotional. He is becoming more trustworthy at a soul level, more able to stay, more able to tell the truth, more able to carry the weight of real intimacy, more able to repair, more able to let love matter without immediately retreating into fear, more able to choose presence over distance, truth over silence, alignment over image. This does not mean every outer detail changes overnight, but the inner architecture is no longer the same. And that is everything, because union is not only about what he feels. It is about whether his presence has become safe enough for sacred love to land inside without being distorted by the old patterns. That is what he is becoming. A man union can trust. A man truth can trust. A man his own soul can trust more than before. And perhaps that is the most beautiful truth of this chapter. When he changes right before union, the signs are not just romantic. They are moral, emotional, spiritual, structural. He becomes more honest, more humbled, more tender, more accountable, less impressed by the old self, less willing to abandon what he loves through fear. That is how you know the shift is real. Not because he suddenly says all the right things. Not because he becomes perfect. Not because the journey gets instantly easy. But because the man who once kept running is becoming someone who no longer wants to live divided from truth. That is the sign. That is the change. That is the sacred evidence that union is no longer only a longing in the distance, but a reality he is finally becoming able to meet. Chapter 9. Why the final transformation often looks messy. One of the greatest misunderstandings about union is this. People expect the final transformation to look graceful. They expect calm, clarity, smooth communication, a steady, obvious rise into emotional maturity. They expect that if union is close, the masculine should look more polished, more composed, more visibly certain. But that is not always how it happens. Very often, right before union, the transformation looks messy. It looks like contradiction. like grief, like inner chaos, like emotional humility, like a man who is finally breaking open in places he spent years trying to keep sealed shut. And this is important to understand, because messiness does not always mean he is moving away from union. Sometimes messiness means the old self is losing its final grip. That is the deeper truth. The final transformation often looks disorderly because what is happening is not surface improvement. It is not a light behavioral adjustment. It is not the masculine becoming slightly more expressive while keeping the same inner architecture intact. No, it is ego death. It is identity collapse. It is the painful reorganization of a man who can no longer live in the same psychological structure and still step into sacred union. That process is rarely neat. Think about what is actually happening. The version of him that depended on distance is dying. The version of him that hid behind silence is dying. The version of him that found safety and control is dying. The version of him that could feel deeply but still avoid truth is dying. Of course, that is messy. Death, even spiritual death, is not elegant when you are inside it. And that is why the final preparation can look like collapse before it looks like peace. He may feel more emotional than usual, more vulnerable, more uncertain in some ways, more aware of grief, regret, tenderness, and the cost of what he almost lost. He may even seem less put together than before. But what if that is because the version of him who looked put together was built on suppression? What if what looked like stability was actually emotional control without truth? What if what looked like strength was actually fear in disciplined form? What if what looked composed on the outside had been quietly dying on the inside for a very long time? Then the messiness starts making more sense. Because final transformation is not about looking better. It is about becoming real. And becoming real usually disturbs the image. The image wants him polished. Awakening wants him honest. The image wants him in control. Awakening wants him surrendered. The image wants him to preserve dignity through distance. Awakening wants him to risk vulnerability for truth. That conflict creates turbulence. And right before union, the turbulence often intensifies because the soul is preparing him for a life where pretense will not work anymore. A life where inner knowing and outward behavior must finally come into alignment. A life where the old tricks, the old escapes, the old emotional disguises are no longer enough to sustain what love is asking from him. So he gets shaken. And the shaking can look different for different men. For some, it looks like inner chaos. They become overwhelmed by what they feel. Their thoughts race. Their emotional world becomes louder. The control they once relied on starts failing, and they do not yet know how to live without it. They feel exposed in ways that make them deeply uncomfortable. For some, it looks like grief. Not just grief over the connection, but grief over who they have been. Grief over wasted time. Grief over how much fear has ruled them. Grief over what they almost lost. Grief over the tenderness they buried for years under image, pride, and emotional discipline. For some, it looks like humility. The arrogance begins breaking. The certainty begins softening. The old masculine posturing begins losing its power. They stop being so impressed by their own defenses. They begin seeing how little those defenses actually protected and how much they cost. And for some, it looks like emotional awkwardness. Because when a man has spent years living behind armor, the first stages of emotional truth are not always smooth. He may fumble. He may say things imperfectly. He may feel far more than he knows how to express. He may look raw rather than refined. But rawness is not failure. Sometimes rawness is the most honest thing he has shown in years. This is why the final transformation so often confuses people. They mistake polish for readiness. They mistake emotional smoothness for real change. They mistake messiness for backsliding. But sacred transformation is not a branding exercise. It is not meant to look impressive at every stage. Sometimes it looks like a man losing the ability to perform who he used to be. Sometimes it looks like a man standing in the ruins of his old identity without yet knowing how to elegantly present the new one. That in-between is messy. But it is holy. Because the in-between is where the false self cannot fully survive and the true self is still learning how to stand. That is exactly why so many pre-union phases feel so unstable. He is between versions. Between the man who ran and the man who can stay. Between the man who hid and the man who can tell the truth. Between the man who wanted love and the man who can finally hold it. Between survival masculinity and sacred masculinity. That threshold is not clean. It is volcanic. Everything that was buried begins surfacing. Everything that was suppressed begins demanding air. Everything that looked manageable under distance and silence becomes unmanageable once truth begins pushing to the surface. And yes, this may look like chaos. But chaos is not always the enemy. Sometimes chaos means the old inner order is being dismantled. The old order said, stay guarded, stay composed, stay emotionally removed, stay powerful by staying distant. Do not reveal too much. Do not need too much. Do not let love break your structure. But right before union, that structure becomes the problem. And so the soul disturbs it. The disturbance is messy because it is undoing years of conditioning, defense, and identity. It is not simply adding peace to his life. It is removing what made false peace possible. That removal hurts. It can make him feel fragile. It can make him feel disoriented. It can make him question everything. It can make him face the difference between who he thought he was and who he actually became under the rule of fear. No wonder it looks messy. But messiness can also be evidence of sincerity. A man who is still fully protected can stay polished. A man who is truly being changed often cannot. Because now the emotions are real. The grief is real. The surrender is real. The reckoning is real. And real things are not always tidy. This is why emotional humility is such a powerful sign right before union. He becomes less performative, less rigid, less invested in always appearing strong, more willing to admit pain, more willing to admit fault, more willing to admit that the version of masculinity he once relied on is no longer enough. That humility is beautiful, but it is rarely glamorous. It may come with tears, with trembling honesty, with confession, with the quiet collapse of pride, with an ache that shows on his face, in his tone, in the softness that starts appearing where hardness used to dominate. This is not weakness. This is what happens when the soul begins winning. And maybe that is the lesson of this chapter. Do not expect the final transformation to always look polished. Sometimes the final transformation looks like a man breaking down because the walls that once kept him emotionally intact are finally falling. Sometimes it looks like him losing certainty because certainty was built on defense, not truth. Sometimes it looks like emotional disorder because the old identity is dying faster than the new one has stabilized. And that is not necessarily a bad sign. It may be the exact sign that union is getting closer. Because the man who enters union is not the man who stays perfectly composed behind his mask. He is the man who let the mask break. He is the man who let grief teach him, who let regret humble him, who let pain soften him, who let conscience wake him, who let the collapse of the old self become preparation instead of punishment. That is why the final transformation often looks messy. Because rebirth is messy. Not because the soul is confused, but because the ego is losing power. Not because union is far away, but because everything false is being shaken loose before something true can finally stand. And perhaps this is the most comforting truth of all. When the final stage looks chaotic, it does not always mean he is failing. Sometimes it means he is no longer able to fake being fine while his soul is trying to become real. That is the mess. And that is the miracle inside it. Because once the chaos has done its work, once the old self has cracked enough, once the false strength has fallen away, something much quieter and truer begins to emerge. A man who does not need the mask anymore. A man who can carry truth without collapsing. A man who no longer mistakes emotional suppression for strength. A man who can step into union not as performance, but as presence. And that kind of man is almost never born in perfect stillness. He is born in the beautiful, painful, sacred mess of becoming. Chapter 10. Union happens when he stops running from himself. After all the silence, all the delays, all the fear, all the inner collapse, all the moments that looked like distance on the outside but felt like war on the inside, we arrive at the deepest truth of this journey. He changes right before union, because union is not only about reaching her. It is about finally stopping the lifelong habit of running from himself. That is the sacred truth hidden underneath everything. For so long, it may have looked like he was running from the connection, from intimacy, from vulnerability, from the divine feminine, from the pressure of sacred love. But deeper than all of that, he was running from what the connection revealed inside him. His tenderness, his fear, his longing, his grief, his unhealed wounds, his need for love, his need to stop pretending he was untouched by something that had already changed him at the soul level. That is why the final shift happens so late for many divine masculines. Because the real battle was never only external. It was internal. The battle between who he had been taught to be and who his soul could no longer keep refusing to become. The old self said, "Stay guarded. Stay in control. Stay unreadable. Stay safe by never fully surrendering. Stay hidden behind logic, distance, timing, pride, and silence." But union cannot be entered by a man still organized around emotional escape. Union asks for presence, truth, integrity, accountability, vulnerability, the courage to stay where the old self would have run. That is why he changes right before union. Because by that point, the cost of running from himself has become too great. He has felt the emptiness of distance. He has felt the exhaustion of control. He has felt the grief of almost loss. He has felt the collapse of the identities that once protected him. He has felt the unbearable truth that he can no longer keep betraying what his soul knows and still call that safety. This is the turning point. Not when he becomes perfect. Not when all fear disappears. Not when every wound is suddenly healed. But when truth becomes more important than self-protection. That is when the real man begins to rise. The man who no longer wants to be admired from a distance more than known in truth. The man who no longer wants to feel love secretly while living in contradiction publicly. The man who no longer wants to keep preserving an image that costs him his own soul. This is what changes right before union. He stops trying to protect the false self. And once that happens, everything begins to align. Because the divine masculine is not made ready for union by emotion alone. He is made ready when he becomes honest enough to stop abandoning himself every time love asks for more depth. He becomes ready when he can finally face what he feels without calling it weakness. When he can admit that his fear has had a voice for too long. When he can see that the distance he created was never true peace. Only a temporary shelter for a self that did not yet know how to live in openness. This is why the journey is so sacred. Because union is not simply a romantic event. It is a spiritual homecoming. A homecoming to truth. A homecoming to emotional integrity. A homecoming to the heart he buried under survival. a homecoming to the version of masculinity that is no longer built on fear of feeling, but on the strength to remain open and real. And perhaps that is why the final phase feels so intense. Because the soul knows he is close. Close not just to her. Close to himself. Close to the moment where he can no longer keep splitting his inner world from his outer life. Close to the moment where sacred love is no longer something he only longs for, but something he becomes capable of honoring. Close to the moment where the old self finally loses its authority, and the truer self steps forward. That step changes everything. Because once he stops running from himself, he also stops running from the love that came to awaken him. Once he stops hiding from his own truth, he no longer needs to hide from the mirror of the divine feminine. Once he stops choosing fear as his compass, union is no longer blocked by the man he used to be. That is the final key. Union does not happen because love suddenly becomes stronger. The love was already strong. Union happens because he becomes less divided, less defended, less avoidant, less loyal to the mask, less willing to let old wounds dictate the future of something sacred. And in that softening, in that surrender, in that holy collapse of the old pattern, he finally becomes reachable to his own soul. That is where union begins. Not first in the outer world. First inside him. In the moment he tells the truth. In the moment he feels the weight of what matters and stops pretending he can answer it later. In the moment he lets pain mature him instead of harden him. In the moment he becomes more devoted to alignment than to image. In the moment he chooses presence over pride. That is sacred masculine rebirth. And this is the message at the center of the entire journey. He changes right before union, because union can only meet the version of him that has stopped running from his own heart. Not the old version. Not the defended version. Not the version that wanted love, but feared truth. The real version. The humbled version. The awakened version. The man who has finally understood that sacred love is not here to flatter his ego. It is here to call him home. So if you are witnessing this shift, whether in yourself or in someone you love, remember this. The delay was not always the end. The silence was not always emptiness. The mess was not always failure. Sometimes all of it was preparation. Preparation for the moment when he could no longer remain the same. Preparation for the moment when fear stopped being enough. Preparation for the moment when he finally understood that the greatest distance was never between him and union, but between him and the truth inside himself. And once that distance closes, union moves nearer than ever before. So if this message found you at the right time, let this be your reminder. Not every delay means the story is over. Not every collapse means something sacred is lost. Not every silence means nothing is changing. Sometimes the deepest transformation happens in the hidden places, right before everything turns. Sometimes he changes right before union, because that is the moment he finally stops running from the man he was always meant to become. If this resonated with you, comment below. He stopped running. And tell me, have you ever witnessed someone change only when they reached the edge of losing something real? Your story may be the confirmation someone else needs today. Subscribe for more deep twin flame insights, divine masculine awakening messages, and spiritual psychology content for the soul journey.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.